Good evening and welcome again, my listening friends, to the DeFi Collective with myself, Robert Vaughn, and our other host, Alex Jewell. We hope you've had a great day and hope you have your listening ears on because we've got some really good information for you tonight. As you know, the DeFi Collective, and we're, the DeFi Collective at gmail.com is our email address. We cover all subjects related to decentralization, decentralized finance, crypto, blockchain, et cetera, metaverse. We cover all those subjects. And tonight, we're going to cover a subject I think that has a lot of relevance for all of us. We're going to cover decentralized communities or decentralized governments, but a decentralized society, what it might look like. And Alex, give us a brief description of decentralization. How would you describe a decentralization for those who are not familiar with it?
Yeah, so, decentralization is this catchword that ends up being used a lot when describing, especially, blockchain and crypto. But, it's not a new concept with this technology. Decentralization has been around for a long time as this idea of not having some central entity that needs to be trusted or that needs to be there to manage the success of something. We've talked about things like worker co-ops before that, this is not a new idea of having like a community of people where everybody contributes in some way so that you don't need somebody that's just trusted in the middle to just do the right thing, right? If you have a community that thrives on itself, that everybody contributes equally, that's an idea of decentralization, even if it's a smaller group of people. It's just the idea that you don't need a leader or a set of leaders in the middle that you just magically trust, but that everybody instead who participates in the system and is, an equal shareholder of the system, they don't need that centralized hierarchy or that centralized system in order to succeed. In fact, many would argue who are in favor of it that this is a better way to succeed when executed properly.
Okay, so decentralization, sometimes you can describe something by looking at its opposite. Centralization is where you have a king or you have one person or one entity in charge, and everything sort of flows out, all the decision making, all the policy, all the administration, everything sort of flows out from one person, one entity. Now, with decentralization, there's what we call a reversal of ownership, where the group of people sort of take ownership for their lives and take ownership for their finances, amongst other things. And there's a reversal of ownership because instead of one person owning everything, everyone has a say-so in how things work. And this was conceptually, I guess, thought of a few thousand years ago as a representative democracy, which theoretically, 10,000 people can't speak at once. So if every 1,000 person elects someone to represent them, and then they take a vote, then that should represent everybody. But what happened was, I want to go back a little bit now. 10,000 years ago, people lived in what's called decentralized communities, where every community was between 1 and 200 people. Everyone knew everyone else, and there's a number called Dunbar's number. Mm-hmm. And what Dunbar's number basically says is that the human brain can remember 150 people and relate to them. Anytime you get up to 250, 300, 400, 500, you don't really know everybody. So there's a need to have representatives, and you can't possibly know 100,000 people. If you're the mayor of a city of 100,000 people, you don't know everybody, but you have council people that know the precinct committeemen, and they may know the people, they may be the people, so that's what decentralization is. And then agriculture came about. And what agriculture did was it made it possible to have larger groups of people live in one city. Mm-hmm. Because now, hunters and gatherers in groups of 10 or 15, could not feed 10,000 people. But, with agriculture, now you could farm land and you could feed a lot of people. So this allowed more people to live together. Now, as a result of that, came what's called centralization, where you had certain people, one person says, I know how to do this better than everybody else. Alex, you're big and strong. We're going to have you, bale the hay. Robert, you can run real fast, so you'll take the messages to everybody, and you had one person sort of calling all the shots. And that's called centralization. And, one of the interesting things is that about the time you had agriculture and centralization, and it wound up in not too many years as a feudal system, where you basically had one guy that was in charge of everything, including whether or not you lived or died,
Right.
You paid homage as well as taxes to him so you could live and work on his land. And this is sort of where it ended up, and a lot of people sort of compare capitalism to that and say that's kind of where capitalism is going. And we'll talk about that a little later. But in terms of centralization, the world became more centralized. And I'll just mention that about the same time that you had agriculture, you also had mass graves,
Mm-hmm.
which meant you had wars, and you also had something else. You had land ownership. So you had land ownership, mass graves, and wars about the same time. Things became more centralized, and I don't think it's stopped yet, has it? It's still been going on for 10,000 years, But, one of the things that we see happening now a lot is that there's a movement, a desire to become less centralized. So there's what we talk about, a reversal of ownership. So people can sort of take charge of their life and have some input. We see this in the form of worker co-ops, where the workers actually own the company and they make decisions based on the company and they split the profits. It's not one guy that owns it, it's everyone that owns it. We also see this, worker co-ops. What are some other examples, Alex, for instance, of decentralization in terms of the economy?
We've got, anything that can have ownership, you have fractionalized ownership, right? So you have buildings that can have, fractionalized owners where everybody who lives in the building has an equal stake in the building, an equal share of it. I guess you could look at like on a small scale, it's like let's say there's a 4-unit building, right? And there isn't somebody who owns the whole building. All 4 people, own an equal share, and they've put together an HOA together, and they, so you have these ideas of decentralization and how people like to own things. But when you start scaling that, you start seeing more capitalistic structures where somebody starts capitalizing on the volume of that, right? So, of course, from an economic perspective and a political perspective, things like decentralized socialism, for example, which goes by many names, everything from council communism to individual anarchism, industrial democracy, participatory economics. So these are all schools of thought where one random little Eastern European country that doesn't exist anymore might have set up a decentralized government at some point that didn't work, or some South American country, maybe like somebody formed a party that floated the idea, right? So you've seen this flirted with, but the reality is the trend overall, at least for the especially for the last century, has been hyper centralization, because what's happened is that people themselves have they've ended up with the luxury of really being able to just focus on one thing, right? So, if I can just have some company or somebody else do this one thing for me, and I can have this other thing happen for me, and like you start seeing all these jobs, but all those jobs cycle, they go up to some company or somebody who offers that. And so people become hyper focused on one thing, and then they don't actually need to own anything anymore, right? you're just sort of a cog in this capitalistic wheel where every unit of wealth that's created centralizes up, our government centralizes up, right? But there's all these examples more theoretically and more hypothetical, more philosophically around decentralization. But really the main examples of successful, real world examples are, like you mentioned, worker co-ops, living co-ops. I mean, you go into a city like Berkeley and there's still, to this day, it's not like a huge hippie town anymore, but to this day, there's still like artist co-ops where a bunch of Berkeley students who, you might think they're homeless. They're not. They like live in a they live in an art building that they all paint on the walls every day, and it's a co-op, right? They all have a job in this system that nobody owns the building except all of them. And so you have this happening where there's fractionalized ownership of things, but they're happening in microcosms and not necessarily at scale.
Okay. Decentralization, basically there are four types: political, administrative, fiscal, and market. Political decentralization would aim to give the citizens or their elected representatives more power in public decision making. It's like now we have, you have 2 senators from each state, and they can basically, 100 people can decide for 300 million people. Well, you don't need childcare, or you don't need new roads. You don't need this, you don't need that. And it could get so bad as to now you have 2 people from 2 states who are kind of blocking progress on a lot of things.
Right.
So that's sort of a centralized power. Now, a decentralized power would perhaps give people more say so in how the senators would vote, for instance, or how the senators would act. We don't, well, Mr. So-and-so, we don't feel that you're doing what's in the best interest of us. So we're gonna decide to do something else. And this is how we want to do it. We've taken a vote and we're going to decide to do something, because these are big decisions.
Right.
And if you carry it to its conclusion, then you have the president who's making decisions whether to go to war for 350 million people.
And sometimes without the permission of Congress. I mean, there's all sorts of things that the executive branch does. And we pretend in school you learn like, oh, checks and balances, blah, blah, blah. And the reality is that a lot of relationships of the executive branch happen very independently and don't necessarily need anybody's permission. And then once somebody else finds out and they're upset, what are you going to do?
I think Trump showed you what checks and balances.
Right.
The weight of checks and balances.
Yeah, he definitely had some checks. I think there's
no balances though. Yeah. But so political decentralization is sort of returning the power to the people. That old slogan keeps popping up.
Right.
And I would say that a lot of times people equate. They give words a negative connotation. For instance, if you were to be called socialist, well, the average person say, well, that's bad, And then you say, well, what is a socialist? Well, I don't really know, but it's bad.
I don't know, but I don't like it.
I don't know, but I don't like it. It's like
they've never read Marx. They've never, they've never read any Engels or anybody. So it's
right. Well, conceptually, they don't understand that basically what socialism is, it's everybody, everybody helps everybody else. And there's not one central person that tends to favor certain people. There may be worker co-ops, maybe Social Security, there's a amount of money that's given to people to work all their lives so they're not poor. That's Social Security. That's socialism. Let's call it what it is. Social Security, if you say that you hate socialists, then refuse your Social Security.
Never go to a public park again. Those are
never go to a public
evil.
park. Don't drive on highways. That's socialism. That's
I only want highways I have to pay for.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
It's not a toll road. I'm not going on it. It's my religion.
I don't trust those free roads.
Yeah, some more socialist programs were unemployment insurance. 5-day work week. There was a time when you worked from sun up to sundown, a 5-day, 40-hour work week. That's a
Yeah.
socialist program. Another one is vacations, at your job every year.
Yeah.
Child labor laws. That's a socialist program.
All these worker rights things, they literally came out of what's known as the progressive era in this country. Throughout,
right.
The early and into the mid-century, they were progressive groups. I mean, I don't think people realize even how violent and traumatic a lot of these fights were for workers' rights. I mean, you're talking about workers who, some people died. I mean, these were very violent things.
There was a massacre at a Standard Oil refinery where almost 300 people were killed. And the company that sort of came into being to squash workers' rights programs was the Pinkerton guys, the Pinkerton men. That's what they were. They were this army, this militia, where they would call, nowadays it would be called a militia. They called themselves security, Pinkerton security. And what they did was they worked for the wealthy people who owned companies to quash riots. And anytime there was a riot, I mean, they would come in and they were pretty ruthless.
Yep.
And since William Randolph Hearst owned most of the newspapers, a lot of the stuff you never heard about. A lot of the stuff would happen. It's not like today where somebody, uses the N word and 3 minutes later it's on the other side of the world, So then something could happen down the street and you never even know about it,
Right.
That's why a lot of things, and that's why it's important. The media is so important.
Yeah, that's freedom of the press. This idea of the press being a public utility, right? That needs to be protected. And we've run into a major issue where a lot of our press, we need to have the freedom for the press, but in reality, we've ended up with press that's just been bought up by, hedge funds. Essentially, I mean, you essentially have companies like BlackRock that swoop in and not only buying houses from people, but they're also buying media companies. You have billionaires, like the guy in Las Vegas. He owns one of the guys who started a lot of the casinos, or a lot of what Las Vegas is today. He owns the media in Las Vegas too. He owns the newspapers, so the newspapers can't write negatively about the guy. He's friends with Trump and all of them, and so you have this serious issue where, because of hyper centralization of power and wealth, if they just buy media company, I mean, look, Bezos owns Washington Post. Is that okay? Should a billionaire who's constantly in the limelight because of workers' rights issues and things that could be spun in his favor, is that okay that he owns such a large national newspaper? That's
and if you own something, there's no such thing as being objective.
Right. It's not. I mean, just realistically,
That's like your boss tells you, he says, well, I want you to be honest with me. Did I screw up? Of course you did.
No, you're great. Yeah.
Who's going to tell you? Well, you should, but then there's the practical side about eating and paying your rent and taking care of your kids and feeding your family.
Yeah. Do you know the Gawker story with Hulk Hogan? Have you heard about that?
No.
So Hulk Hogan,
vaguely, yeah.
Hulk Hogan had a sex tape that got released, and the Gawker, which was a pretty lowbrow media company, to be fair, posted. They published an article about it. Now they weren't the ones who necessarily released this or released news about it. This was all over the place already. I think TMZ was probably one of the original people to even publish it. But Gawker tended to be a company that found things out about people that were more sensitive. They kind of wanted to speak truth to power in many ways, and they were the ones that were going to not make friends a lot of the time. And they were an independent media company, and there's a lot of power in that when you have an independent media company that can kind of publish whatever they want, right? And that isn't owned by some larger company. Well, Hulk Hogan ends up suing them, and not only suing them, but suing them for a very traumatic amount of money in terms of the companies, and not only suing them, but suing the chief editor and suing the individual journalist who wrote the article. as if it was, and it wasn't his decision. This was all over his head, this decision to publish this article. He was just a random journalist at the Gawker. So they sue them for $100 million, which is ludicrous, right? And especially when you're talking about a smaller independent company, if they had, when they lost this, it was, that breaks their business, and as individuals ruins them financially as well. Well, over the course of this, they were wondering, how is Hulk Hogan funding this? Because he had these high powerful lawyers, they were going through court. It was a large sum of money. And so they were kind of confused because Hulk Hogan had some financial issues. And this whole thing, he actually, because of this scandal, he had actually lost, because a video came out of him saying the N-word and all this stuff around the same time from the same sex tape. The reason that they cared so much about the sex tape is because he had also, in the rest of the tape, said a bunch of racial slurs. So that was ending for a lot of his partnerships and lucrative business deals. And so they were wondering how he was funding this. Well, it turns out that Peter Thiel, one of the co-founders of PayPal, was secretly bankrolling the case. And so here's this billionaire who has sort of like eccentric ideas anyway about society and about the press and about like rebuilding society with no rules. He like literally floats the idea of like just building an island for the billionaires to live on where they don't have to follow any rules. I mean, like, this guy has these kinds of ideas, and it turns out that he was the one paying for this lawsuit, not because he cared about Hulk Hogan, but because a couple years earlier they had written some articles about him being gay, and he hadn't come. I think there was like some confusion about it, and he was so upset by this being revealed on Gawker that he had held a grudge, and just because of his wealth was able to take, the company filed bankruptcy. So he was able to take this entire company out in the state of Florida where Hulk Hogan was from. So of course the jury was like, we love Hulk Hogan, don't hurt his feelings. He like cried.
Hulkamania rules.
Yeah, he like cried in court. So the jury was like, man, they like destroyed this poor guy that we love. And it's like such a private matter. They didn't realize this was really an issue of freedom of the press, right? It sounds like a stupid example, but the minute you have billionaires buying up newspapers in Las Vegas, or billionaires funding whatever frivolous cases they want to and being able to win them just because they have more money, you have a major concern in terms of the upholding democracy, because democracy is ultimately upheld by some sort of objective flow of truth, right? Of freedom of the press, so that in that centralization, we don't lose sight of what the truth is. And obviously we've already had that problem because all these social media giants themselves end up being our source of truth. And a lot of the news media ends up being our sources of truth. And so there aren't easy ways for people to think critically about those things all the time or know what the truth is. And we've seen that effect on our democracy already.
And something I forgot to mention, you just reminded me, Alex, is when you had centralization, roughly about the same time that land ownership came up, and you had these wars and these mass graves that all happened about the same time. That also sort of was the beginning of democratic principles, saying that, the sense of being fair and sharing, why should he have 1,000, pounds of meat and I don't have any, and how do we kind of make this more even and make this more fair? And I think what's happened is that, I read an interesting statistic the other day. It says if you get $1 billion, you can get $2 billion in about 2 or 3 years. And the more money you have, the easier it is to get a lot more. Whereas to get that first billion might be pretty hard, but once you get that first billion, it's pretty. So it's a matter of our centralized political system works in favor of certain people, and that's what happens when you get a centralized political system. You have, it's just like if a billionaire or somebody wealthy gets busted for something, you say, oh well, no, he's not going to jail.
Right.
Like everybody knows it, and he kills 46 people and he gets probation. He gets 2 months probation. And then everybody says, well, yeah, I figures, he was a rich guy, he was a billionaire, and we all knew. But there's something wrong with that. And I think a
They've
lot of people,
normalized that idea, right?
yeah, they've normalized it, and
Yeah.
one of the things that decentralization does is it makes the playing field more level. And it does that in a number of ways, through politics. For instance, I'll give you another example. Alex, we've talked about this before, how the blockchain um, can sort of even a playing field in a lot of different ways. For instance,
Yeah.
we had blockchain voting, which I think we probably will eventually. Then you have a distributive ledger that is tamper proof. So everybody votes, and there's no way that your vote could be tampered with because there would be a record of how you voted.
Right.
So when the votes are tallied up, there'll be a trail to the tally of the votes. And this could be done by computer and it could be done by hand. And you would come out with the same result. So I think something like, voting, blockchain voting may not be that far off, because, we
Right.
hear people say, well, they manipulated the votes and this, blah, blah, and that, and you get situations where people are so apathetic. And I think people in power, they like people to be apathetic because then it doesn't take but a small number of people to hold on to power.
Well, apathy is is such a threat to democracy, and apathy is generated through abstraction. So the more that you have abstraction and the more that abstraction leads to ambiguity or confusion, not knowing which side is up, right? The more that you can kind of confuse people and hit them from all angles and overwhelm them, the more that they sort of just give up on having like a valuable opinion about something. And a lot of the time, worse is they'll just settle for whatever opinion is the most convenient because the abstraction of things is dangerous to people understanding them. The reality is that the more complex society becomes and the more, and I think this is where the key is too, the more layers of abstraction you are from something you should care about, the less you know about it and the less you can develop your own educated opinion about that thing. Look at science, right? A lot of people who have developed very anti-science attitudes don't know somebody who's a scientist. they don't know people who do research.
Or they're in schools where they didn't study science or scientific.
Right. It wasn't, maybe it was abstracted so much that they maybe got a couple ideas, but why would they believe those ideas, right? They haven't seen those ideas in practice. They haven't, they've maybe had a couple bad experiences with a doctor, right? And so the moment you start abstracting these things and people are several degrees separated from government or science or institutions of any kind that they need to trust, the moment that abstraction allows them to, feel apathy and feel disconnected and feel not represented, and that creates, instead of them engaging more, it creates dissent, right? Or it creates it creates disconnect, and it allows people to not care to the extent that those who do care enough out of some bad agenda are the only ones engaging. The only ones engaging are the people who seek to win by controlling it, not in favor of the people anymore. So when we talk about decentralization of those things, it's that return of ownership is more than just like a return of responsibility, but it's a return of how closely connected are you to the systems that matter to you, right? Talking about things like decentralized voting, but also, open source legislation. Imagine instead of lobbyists or corporations handing stacks of finished legislation to a legislator, but imagine you have a duty as a citizen to read a couple simple bullet points, not legalese, but you can read some bullet points. You can contribute your own ideas. Others can vote on your ideas, and everybody can contribute together and upvote other people's ideas. And a legislator can refine those ideas and essentially take everything, not just how people have voted to trust them, but certain lawmakers can actually take that legislation and those ideas directly from constituents who have contributed them, and they've all been voted on individually as individual bullet points. And you start seeing the beauty of decentralizing even the idea of legislation, right? And that sounds silly, but with technology, it's actually really possible. I mean, when's the last time you read through something on the internet that took you 10 minutes. But imagine if that was like you making a decision on an important piece of legislation.
Right. And here again, we talk about involvement. You have to be involved. And I think, if you ask most people, money has corrupted a lot of things. And capitalism is a system where the winner is the one who makes the most money.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it doesn't, it almost doesn't really matter how you make the money, because at one time, gangsters and drug dealers were buddy with senators. They probably still are. Now it's not so popular. But I mean, if you made money illegally, Al Capone was like this big celebrity. People, and I think one of the things that capitalism has done, it's made the end justify the means when it comes to making money.
Right.
And a good example of that was slavery. They say, well, look, these people work. You pay one time for them and you just feed them, and they work. You don't have to pay them anything.
Yeah.
Now how, instead of paying them $5 an hour, you don't have to pay them anything. Now, how profitable would your business be then? And see, that was all driven by capitalism. And I think, we got an argument about this on my other show did capitalism cause racism, or was racism a byproduct of capitalism? I mean, was racism sort of enhanced by capitalism to justify? Was capitalism justify racism? And it was a thought-provoking conversation, because if there was no financial benefit to owning slaves, I don't think anybody would have cared one way or another.
Right.
And
yeah, that's an interesting.
It made your company much more profitable. But
yeah,
I guess
the chicken or the egg come first, right?
I
don't know.
Yeah. But I guess when you're in justifies a means, and I think kids are taught now at a young age to, just win, baby, just win, and if you got $1 billion in the bank, most people don't really know or care how you got it. It's just, it puts you in a different category. I mean, let's face it, it puts you on the other side of the fence. And I think
a lot of the time they only care once there's a visible reason why they should, right? There's a reason for their own survival. No bank cares about where somebody got their money until the bank is at risk, right? So, you don't like, this really comes down to survival of the capitalistic entity. And as long as what you're doing isn't reflecting poorly on them yet, or even sometimes if it is, but it isn't threatening their business, go for it. Yeah.
and it's funny because I used to have an artist in Florida, in Miami, and I would go down there a lot to Miami and Doral and Tampa. And I could not believe in Doral and Miami, Florida, how many different banks there are.
Well, Miami, I mean,
you could walk down the street 3 blocks and see 15 different banks.
Criminal money is at the heart of Miami.
Yeah. And these are banks you never heard of, but they're banks that have a lot of money, and you can deposit money and do whatever else you do. But I was really shocked. I mean, there's so many banks, it's like ridiculous, man.
It's amazing. Some of them change their name on a weekly basis too.
yeah. But I think what decentralization does, and why there's so much pushback, is that it kind of levels the playing field.
Right.
And if you're sort of at the remember when we were kids, we used to play King in the Mountain, where when I was young, they were doing all these construction projects and they had these big mounds of dirt. So if you were king in a mountain, you got and stood on top, and somebody else tried to come along, you pushed them off. And somebody pushed you off, and they were king in a mountain, and that's kind of like what they do now, is king in a mountain, instead of they saying, well, you know what, there's enough mountain up here for the 3 of us, and we could hire 10 more guys at Fox News to keep all the rest of the people.
Well, you just start mining blocks for it, and you
Yeah.
just make it.
Yeah, you start
Yeah,
mining.
it removes those abstractions, right? When I want to do something on blockchain,
Mhm.
see, this is a good example of the abstraction concept of, like, right now when I log into Facebook and then I go and I browse the internet, I don't see any of the things that are happening behind the scenes. People don't realize this. If you're anywhere else on the internet after you've logged into Facebook, they're with you. They're like hanging out with you, checking it out. You don't know that. You're not seeing the, unless you're opening developer tools and looking at network tools and like looking at the network product, the exchange of data. You're not seeing any of that. You're just like,
when you signed in, you gave them that permission. You gave them that
right.
permission. Yeah.
So you don't see any of that. But when you want to make a change on the blockchain, if I just want to like change my profile on something that's a Web3, a Web3, a blockchain app, decentralized app, if I want to change one input field on my bio, my wallet opens up and I have to sign it. And so it takes the abstraction out so that you have complete ownership and autonomy in every decision that's made. And to some people that may sound annoying, but the reality is that without having that autonomy in your life, there are ways we can automate it and make it easier. But the reality is, without that in your life, especially in terms of how we build society, your abstraction or disconnect is what creates the when the simulation plays out, it's what creates the negative results, right? Is like when you're no longer directly engaged with the details of democracy, then you no longer have democracy. You're just magically trusting a bunch of people in the middle to do everything right for you, but you're not engaging enough to ensure that happens. And the fact is that human nature is pretty flawed, and we keep trying to build these systems to take those flaws out of it. And the reality is that, we have these abilities now to create technology that takes the power of that community, that decentralization we had as tribes, and take the power of our development, our technological advancement, our civilization of today, and put those things together. And that's pretty miraculous, right? That's a pretty amazing thing when you really think about it in terms of the implications.
Yeah. And just to switch gears a little bit here, let's talk about Chile.
Yeah.
This is a case study because we talk about decentralization, the nature of it, and now we're going to talk about the significance of it and how it has real world consequences. Now, I can remember when I was younger, Salvador Allende was the head of the Chilean government, and he was, from the news reports here, he was this leftist socialist. He was just this awful person, and he had to be killed. He had to be destroyed. And at that time, the United States was, they were taking down, Dominican Republic, they were taking down guys,
Yeah, we were mad at the embargo on Cuba was beginning, right? There's all these things.
That's why we're pissed off at Cuba for 60 years, because we couldn't take them down the way we wanted to. Right. But we took, I guess Castro had 300 attempts on his life, right, by the CIA and the mob, which at one time was pretty much the same thing for you. Obviously, right. You don't know. And a lot of South American countries, Ecuador, I believe Brazil at one time, the United States, and not so much the United States, but the billionaires, the ruling class, ITT, companies like ITT,
Coca-Cola,
yeah, Maxwell House Coffee, had interest, and they said, this guy is going to take all our companies and he's going to divvy up the money and give it to the whole country.
Wasn't a pet? There was like a pet food company too that was mad about it.
Yeah, Purina. Yeah, a pet food company. Yeah, because they said this guy, and they tried to do everything they could to stop him, but he got elected anyway, because what was happening is the money that was produced in Chile was taken. For instance, copper. They had copper mines, and 2 U.S. companies owned 80% of the copper mines. So they would take the copper from Chile, they would put it in cars and electronics, and they would sell it back to Chile, which by that time they had no money to buy it. you know,
Oh yeah, the workers were treated extremely,
yeah,
like
yeah. So
terribly
they
paid,
couldn't
almost
even
nothing.
buy the products that their natural resources made. So, Salvador Allende said, you know what, we're gonna change this, and we're gonna have a central entity that's gonna look at all this stuff, and we're gonna make sure everything is a little more fair. Would that be a good description? And talk about that for a minute, Alex.
Yeah, I mean, what Allende did was pretty remarkable, because compared to other socialists who at the time ended up being more fascist, right? They ended up, people, Cuba was a great example. Cuba took complete control, right? And there's a lot of, leftists who
And
still,
that's why socialists and leftists got a bad name,
right.
because of the socialists that adopted the fascist principles and tendencies. But go ahead. I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah. But there's a lot of even disagreement in terms of like, well, what led to that violence, right? Like
Mhm.
Allende in his situation probably could have resorted to violence as a means of defending the country,
Mhm.
and that could have been maybe more successful. So a lot of people ask this question of, does this toxification of the power in a lot of progressive states, has it actually really been the direct result of external pressures of capitalism and the West, right? Trying to kill them, right? So you
Mhm.
have this, like, there is a lot of debate about what actually causes that, right? When you do have somebody, perhaps in Cuba's case, where you do have people who probably have good intentions for their country and for their people, but maybe different ideology about how to defend it, right? Because we know that after Cuban officials visited Chile, they left with the remark that they were leaving more radicalized than they had come. And they basically said, good luck with this nonviolent thing. You guys suck. You're going to die.
Yeah,
Like, that was basically
idiots. Yeah, yeah.
they're
Total
like, you
idiot.
don't have any guns? What are you doing? So the reality is that what Allende built, though, was pretty remarkable, because if there hadn't been these external forces, if there hadn't been capitalistic forces running the US government in terms of the Red Scare, which was really just a scare of corporations losing their investments in countries like Chile, then it probably would have worked, because what he created was a nationalization of the things that people needed, right? He created nationalization of their factories, created nationalization of their telecom, created nationalization of their food, right? And a lot of the times in history, these things have been attacked as like, well, that just, people have known the examples of how it didn't work, right? Of how it creates mass famine and things like that, because governments typically are pretty inefficient, because they're not motivated the same way corporations are. There's an inherent difference in how corporations succeed versus governments, right? Corporations succeed because their bottom line depends on them getting the product out. So if a corporation is going to make money by getting the product out, then they get the product out. But a government doesn't make more money by getting the product out, right? And so you end up with this situation where perhaps greed within the government, if funds start getting diverted, if people aren't motivated to do it the same way, because like it's just our government program, you end up with differences in incentive that can result in differences in quality, right? And this is a real concern. It's a valid one. So how do we incentivize good nationalistic programs? Well, Allende did a pretty good job because people were very well paid. They were taken care of very well. The system incorporated, and this was revolutionary at the time. It was a cyber system. They call it cyberkin or some, cybersyn. Call it cybersyn. And one of the components of this like multi-system computer system, one of the components was feedback. And the feedback was anonymized from all the different factories, as well as metrics from all the different factories too. So you have one system that's monitoring the actual metrics of all of these factories and could actually algorithmically make decisions to redivert things so that the system didn't have lags, that you didn't have like imbalances of products and things like that. And then you had the inclusion of their actual feedback in terms of like, well, we're making decisions now based on how people are feeling, as well as the objective data of how things are doing, and a computer system that's, pretty distributed because it's connecting to all these nationalized factories and farms and things. And I mean, anybody could look at that idea and be like, it seems like a pretty good idea. If you don't tell them it's socialism, and you don't tell them it's Allende, and you don't tell them it's Chile, somebody could look at that and be like, that's a pretty cool system. But the moment you say socialism and you say nationalized factories and stuff, well, people they have a lot of emotional reactions to it because of the programming, especially the West has around socialist programs. But Allende wasn't violent. He wasn't killing his people. When you listen to things that he said, it was all about the workers having their rights and having good lives. And so,
yeah. And it's like, yeah, it's funny. I laugh because American companies took that same technology and used it in American companies, in auto manufacturing, that whole feedback loop idea. And they used it they got feedback from some of the workers because the unions were very powerful at a particular point in time. And this was all integrated, in production. When you were, when you were a production manager, you could sit in your office and you could monitor 500 people. And you could also look at different plants, seeing what parts they needed, how fast you had to get these parts here. You could look at the raw materials from the steel and see, this is the idea that was born in Chile.
Right.
But
this is well before.
It was well before. Yeah. This was well. This
had
was
never been done before.
Yes, never been done before. But they borrowed the technology to make plants more efficient, and now everybody uses it.
But not more efficient for the people, right? This is where it's interesting to make money.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do. The feedback has nothing to do with the workers developing units of wealth for themselves. Oh, wow. It's a matter of keeping workers content to develop units of wealth for a set of executives, right?
But see, here's where worker co-ops come in. Now, say if these were worker co-ops, then the workers would actually benefit from the money they made.
Right.
Imagine, I don't know, I read some calculations a couple of months ago that if Amazon was a worker co-op, the average worker would be around 220 grand a year. That would be their salary instead of 15.
And they probably wouldn't have to pee in a bottle.
And they probably wouldn't have to pee in a bottle. But a worker co-op where the workers actually own the production facilities in the plant, and this is not something that's unheard of. I think there are worker co-ops, I think in Spain. I think there are some very successful ones in Spain, in Greece, in the Netherlands. So this is not an idea that's some pie in the sky idea. It's an actual idea. If you were an Amazon delivery driver and you actually were one of the owners of the company, and the more money the company made, the more money you paid, you would probably try to be more efficient. And I think everybody in a worker co-op, tries to be more efficient because you're actually the owner, and if you steal money, you're stealing from yourself,
right.
And that, you don't steal from yourself,
I think you have systems in place.
Even if you're a thief, right?
You have systems in place to deal with that kind of thing. Whereas right now, an executive does something not great for the worker. What are the workers can't do anything, right? Like, right. I mean, they just have to be like, well, I guess that's what they do. I mean,
and I think, go ahead. I'm sorry.
You look at a company like Alta, for example. I had a friend recently I was talking to who worked at Alta, and they pay well below market for a lot of different positions. And I was joking because a recruiter had actually reached out to me from Alta on the technology side. And I was like, that was well below market. She's like, yeah, they pay really below market. She said, but they promised this bonus based on reaching financial goals. And come to find out that for the last several years, they've intentionally created financial projections that they weren't going to meet so that they didn't have to pay out the bonuses to
Oh, I
anybody.
know, man. Yeah,
So, I mean, you look at things like that, and that seems like a relatively benign thing. It seems like a relatively normal thing, but that's because we've normalized these kinds of things of like, well, that's just what companies do because they have to make more money. But you look at how much their executive suite made.
yeah.
And it wasn't, I mean, they multiplied their wealth over the last few years.
Yeah, yeah. And it's worker co-ops, I think, are an idea whose time has come. And I think, you're starting to see them around the world in different countries, and they're successful. Successful. Not saying that every company has to be a worker co-op, but I'm not sure if it was Spain or some company that if the company is going to be sold and employs more than 100 people, they have to give the workers the option of bidding on a company. And the government will actually loan the workers the money to buy the company. And they'll run the company and they'll pay it back, And, one of the best ways to, I remember I was a production manager at an automotive manufacturing place. And this guy came in from Detroit. He was an industrial engineer. And he said, you should come work with me. I said, why? He said, let me show you how easy this is. He said, they're going to pay me almost 300 grand for 2 months. And I'm going to put together a report that tells them how to make this place run more efficiently. I said, well, do you have a lot of training? That must take a lot. He said, no. He said, I just go around and ask everybody how to do the job better. He said, right. And then I put it in this 200-page report and I put all this color on it. And he said, and that's how you do it. He said, I never worked here. This guy's been doing a job for 30 years. He said, I'm going to tell him how to do better. He said, I asked him, he tells me how to do it better. He said, and all I have to do is buy him lunch. It was so funny, man. And the people what he was saying, the people actually work here, they know how to do the job.
Right. They do the job every day. Yeah. Yeah.
You don't
exactly.
need me, but they're going to pay me all this money for putting together a report. And that's what he did. He went around and
but you have layers of abstraction so that people can focus on. Yeah. I mean, so when you look at that model, but you look at like decentralization for a society, what builds a society is very complex, right? And this is why government's often really inefficient, because you have a lot of moving parts and other parts are talking to each other, and they all have different legacy contracts with different systems that don't talk to each other. And you have, people that have been reading magazines every day for the last 100 years, every day on the job. So like you have these challenges in government bureaucracy and government systems. And the reality is that we do have the technology to run highly complex systems. You look at a company like Amazon, we figured it out for corporations, right? Corporations had the incentive to figure it out. They had the incentive to figure out.
You know how crazy this is? Just not to cut you off, but you're talking about the efficiencies.
Mm-hmm.
I told my wife, I said, I ran out of vitamins. I need some vitamins. I said, call Amazon and order me some vitamins. 12:45, she called Amazon. 2:00.
Right.
Yeah. The vitamins are at my
prime now. You don't have to
Amazon, it's less than 2 hours, man. I was like, wait a minute. I couldn't have driven to the store and picked them up that quickly.
Yeah, they drive up in their little blue van and they they throw it out. Like, this is the efficiency of the system.
Yeah.
Is we've had no problem doing that when people were incentivized to do it. So we have the technology. We have the ability to understand complex systems. We've literally spent the last century with capitalistic entities doing research and development on how to solve these problems for society. But the problem is they didn't solve them for society. They solved them for their own bottom line. And that's actually not in favor of human quality of life or worker quality of life or worker quality at work, right? And we need to transfer that mentality and that sort of technology to a government system. And when you pair that with decentralized technologies like blockchain, you're able to do that. And that's ultimately why we talk about the implications of decentralized technology all the time in a lot of, more specific cases. But the reality is that it solves all of these problems
Mhm.
of, making something that's maybe worked for a company work in a way where you own it
Yeah,
yourself.
right, right, right. And Bezos built Amazon, but he didn't do it by himself.
Yeah.
I mean, you just look at they had a lot of support. They used the streets. He didn't pay taxes a couple of years. There's wear and tear on the street. You have to change the traffic patterns. It causes delays to other people when you have an Amazon warehouse. And the funny thing is, that all Amazon warehouses in Northeast Ohio are where malls used to be.
Right.
Where the malls used to be. And it's great. Nothing wrong with making money. Of course, we would never argue with that. But I think you have to also be a good corporate citizen, man. This society, there should be some benefit to society, because if everybody just takes and nobody gives back, pretty soon the middle class people, they don't need malls anymore, because the middle class people don't have the disposable income they had 20 years ago.
Right.
Which means they can't buy a lot of the products that you're manufacturing. The average price for a new car now is $41,000.
Yeah.
If they can get you to lease it, they can probably squeeze about 52 out of it, because they
Right.
get you to rent it, then they resell it. And that's one reason the used car market is up. There's not a chip shortage with cars. There's not a chip shortage. You want to pay 100 grand for a car, you can go buy a Tesla or a Mercedes all day long. You can buy a Porsche. The Porsche lot is full of cars. So there's not a chip shortage with cars. It's that they needed to pump up that used car market. So when you walk on a lot now, a Ford or Chevy lot, a lot of them just have used cars, and that's what people are buying. Now, I think as people get poorer and poorer, the prices are going to have to come down, because it's hard to afford a $41,000 car. If you're making 100 grand a year, a $41,000 car is probably not, a good investment, or not, probably not a wise, expenditure of your money. But I think as things like worker co-ops become more prevalent in this country, and there are a few in this country, by the way. It's not something that's unheard of. Where the workers actually own the place of business, and they split up, the profit. And I think that you're going to see a change in attitudes. I think it's something that you don't read a lot about. If you Google worker co-ops in the United States, you'll probably be surprised. There may even be one close to where you live. But it's just not something that it's not going to be broadcast all over. But decentralization, and we didn't cover. Maybe we'll cover this next week. Decentralized finance. That's the name of our show, the DeFi Collective. But decentralized finance, with cryptocurrency, that's a whole nother ballgame.
Right. Yeah. It takes the idea of decentralization and it provides sort of the perfect technology for it. Right. At the end of the day, if you decentralize right now without crypto or without blockchain, you're still using centralized services to do it, right? You're still using Google Docs and Amazon Web Services, and you're still relying on some hedge fund that owns your building, and you're still dealing in the currency of centralized finance to a degree, right? In centralized society, even if you're developing a decentralized entity. And DeFi allows you to not have to do that. You can bypass the traditional centralized ecosystem.
Right. And it's here to stay. It's not something, like a lot of people say, what was it? Bank of America said, oh, it's crypto, it's just a fad. And they went and opened the crypto department.
Right. Yeah.
Now they're buying crypto.
No, all of them are pouring in. Yeah.
Yeah, all of them are pouring in because they want to figure out how to corner the market on it, which isn't so easy. I think where the test is really going to come is when the governments start saying you can pay your taxes in crypto. So no, because pretty soon they will have a lot of crypto.
It would
But
be kind of nice because right now I have to pay taxes twice on crypto if I use my crypto to pay for taxes, because I have to pay taxes on the crypto that I've already converted, taxable events. And then the moment that I cash out on the crypto to pay my taxes, then all of a sudden I'm paying a tax again.
yeah,
So it'd
yeah.
be efficient if I could just pay in crypto, but that's when I advocate for fair taxation, I have to live that, right? So I can't, I have to take my own advice and pay my fair share of taxes. So
That's right. But also you can, if you lose money with crypto, I don't know how the tax code is set up, you should be able to declare a loss.
well, yeah,
Your
that's what,
crypto
unfortunately, I didn't,
is held within
unfortunately,
a
I've never
health.
lost anything.
Okay,
So,
yeah, no, and most people don't. I mean,
yeah,
if you just
unfortunately,
hold
every
it,
year
yeah,
has been pretty solid.
yeah. If you just hold it, you're probably not going to lose in the long term.
That's where a lot of people are misusing NFTs, because they'll have multiple wallets, they'll sell NFTs to themselves at a loss.
Mhm,
They own the NFT still, but then they're reporting that as a loss.
mhm.
So
Yeah, and the government's kind of wise to it. I mean, because they'll so you gotta.
I've seen that with art and real estate before. It's not like crypto's some new haven for tax
This,
evasion. The reality is tax evasion is a part of society, not
yeah, it
a
is.
problem of crypto, right?
Yeah. You're
So,
right. So yeah. Well, unfortunately, our time is up, but we thank you for yours. And again, the DeFi Collective at gmail.com is our email address. You can find us at the DeFi Collective on YouTube or Let's Talk Radio with a Y, RADYO. Let's Talk Radio, the DeFi Collective. Please subscribe to our channel. Like us. We're on Facebook. Check us out. We cover a number of different subjects. I'm sure there'll be some that interest you. And I kind of see us going towards crypto next week or something like that. And maybe that's something we need to talk about: crypto and taxes. How about that?
tax episode, yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. We'll have
The
to.
most depressing episode we've
Yeah.
had.
That would nobody would watch this. No, I'm not watching this now. So we're not going to do crypto and taxes next week. So I'll just get that out there. But from Robert Vaughn, thank you for watching. And Alex, any closing thoughts?
No.
Okay. Well, I'll continue to say it. Wear your mask. See you next week.
Have a good one, guys.
Bye-bye.